Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
I have no idea what I'm going to say. The menagerie of books that I've written, as Joe intimated, they're all over the lot. And I think I would have done better if I had stuck with one style. I'm not likening myself to James Patterson, but he's a favorite of mine. And you get your style, or crime books, W. Michael Phelps, and you keep rewriting the same book over and over again. Like Patterson, I love his New York Cop. Anybody read about him? Mike Bennett. I love the Mike Bennett series. He's a good cop. He's got like 10 kids, and it's very well written. But I've been all over the place, and I would I got on last night to see which ones are more available in the Upper Hudson Library. The novel, Elegy of Innocence, is in the Upper Hudson system, and then it got published twice, flopped both times. And the first time, it was a Catholic house that had it, our Sunday Visitor. And they got wet feet right as soon as it came out on the market. They yanked it. And then a secular house, Stein and Day, picked it up and changed the title, which we argued about. And they're both. And one guy ended up, he said, "Well, I like your first novel," so I bought the second. Then I realized it was the first novel. Keep changing the names. I wrote Dagger John, which is, if there's any book that I had that's spread around, it's that one. And it's because it was a biography of Archbishop John Hughes, who built St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and who on his best days was like Harry Truman, on his worst days like King Kong. He was a tough man. And but Cardinal O'Connor bought the remainders, if you will. He bought a copy for every priest in the archdiocese. And I talked about that with a priest from New York, and I said, "What's this thing with us?" And he said, he thinks he is John Hughes. Nice man, though. He invited me down to the powerhouse, as they call it. And we celebrated Mass in the cathedral. And then afterwards, it was a weekday, went for breakfast, and there was a menagerie of guys living there, like eight of them. And it was one fun breakfast. I mean, he knows he's boss of a little mafia, but he'd laugh and they'd all laugh and that sort of thing. But one guy kept studying me, and he said, what was I saying about Ernie Tatro? Because he and I gave a talk here many years ago. And afterwards I said, you knew my father. He said, "I've been trying to figure out what you look like." And a priest, middle-aged guy, was looking across the table for a while, and he says, "You got a relative named Bob Shaw?" And I said, "Yeah, I got an Uncle Bob." And he said, "Tell him Camp St. John's." And I said, "Oh, my dad was there too." And he said, Joe Shaw. And he said, "Oh yeah, but he was older than us. We didn't fool around with him." And it was, it was like blasts from the past. It was a fun meal. And I think fondly of Cardinal O'Connor because of that. But he bought most of the copies to Dagger John. All those are present in the Upper Hudson. The ones that are not were John Dubois, founding father. You know what? Somebody came up and told me, I can't believe this, we're in a whole new age now, that he saw Dagger John on the internet for $175. And I thought, I didn't make that much money on that the first run. It gets better. When I finished the Hughes book, I decided I want to write one on his predecessor, about whom nobody had written a book, and that really tanked. That's on the internet for $285. I can't believe it. I mean, it's like the stamp with the plane upside down has become famous because there's so few of them. And Pentecost Eve, which I had more fun researching and writing than anything I did, and that didn't even make the light of day. Chaplains to the Imprisoned, and I'll in a few minutes talk about that as a predecessor to the current book. It was my doctoral dissertation. And doctoral dissertations always read like doctoral dissertations, but it's on library shelves in schools of criminal justice because nobody had ever done a study on chaplains before. My academic chair, a great man named Dr. Hans Toke, wanted me to replicate what he had written about corrections officers and police and working with stress. And so, he guided me toward that. It's not what I wanted to write. I wanted to write about the shock prisons because that's where I was working at the time. And then I sold it as a book. Hayworth brought it out. And simply because it is that study, there's only one group in prisons who nobody's written about yet. Maintenance people. You say, why is that so important? They have access to everything in a prison. Think about that. They're interesting and worth studying because of that. Anyway, I'm not going to do that one. And just very quickly, because most of them are sourced, every one of them was done in a different way. The Hughes book, and of course he lived in the 19th century, and I pretty much just followed his footsteps. He came from Ireland in 1817 as a teenager, and gradually fought and argued his way into the seminary at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg. And so I went everywhere looking for sources. I was so shocked when I got to the Archdiocese of New York, and I'd never been in their archives before. Terribly kept. Everything was just all over the floor like old boxes in your attic, and I couldn't believe it. At one point, I found a letter to Hughes from President Lincoln, and somebody had razored his signature out. You keep these things carefully locked up and behind plastic sheets or something like that. Since it was an Oldman Senior, it was like a job they'd give to somebody, and he wasn't really. A nun who had a library science took over, and she really changed the place. When I did his predecessor, and I fell in love with the guy, as I wrote in the preface to the Dubois book, Hughes was no saint, but Dubois was. I've always said that in Emmitsburg, Maryland, they canonized Elizabeth Seton as a saint. There should have been a triple canonization. Her, Jean Dubois, and blank out on it, Simon Boutet. And they were kind of a team together. Jean Dubois escaped from the French Revolution. He just missed the September massacres. If you ever go to Paris, go to the Rue de Carme. And for decades after the revolution, they had no idea what happened to the bodies of the priests they killed. And it was a September day. It was their last chance to sign over to the Concordat with the state. A lot of them refused, and they were all executed that day. And finally, in the 1830s, when everything had kind of settled down, it was an old revolutionary soldier who came to the then Archbishop of Paris, and he said, I know where the bodies are. And they dug them up. And if you go down into the Rue de Carme, an old Carmelite monastery, don't go alone. They have a basement chapel, and they didn't have the scaffold. The heads weren't with the bodies, so they've put all the heads behind glass, and you go in there and hello. I didn't think I would find enough sources for Dubois. And of course, I had to go over, broke my heart, to Paris. But I had so much fun over there. For instance, after the French Revolution, all church records were no longer kept at the churches. And they gathered them again. They're in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And when he escaped from Paris, Dubois, and he got out with a letter from Robespierre. They were grammar school classmates. I had fun researching this. And in the Bibliothèque Nationale, I put in a request, just like you do at the State Library here. And my French really stinks, but I practice, okay, this is what I want. And I didn't put the date on it. They brought up all the archives from Saint-Sulpice going back to like the 9th century when it began as a church. I was like a kid on Christmas. I had so much fun, looking at these old parchment things. When you think that's 3 times older than the United States of America. He escaped to this country not being able to speak a word. In fact, found an author, his book had been translated in English, on Robespierre. And I went out to visit him in a suburb outside of Paris. I had one of my sisters with me at the time. We had such a nice afternoon. He went out and picked cherries from the cherry tree. and they served us that wine, and it was so civilized. And we were going through, trying to find out if my Dubois was his Dubois in the book. And you got to know that over in France, John Dubois is like Joe Smith. And I went down the gamble that it was, because they were in a scholarship school. And that's why somebody once called it the School for Revolution, the school of Louis le Grand. And the king started it for poor boys with good brains. And the classmates, Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre, and John Dubois, he walked to Le Havre, got out of the city, just missing the September massacres, got on a boat and ended up in Norfolk, Virginia. At Mount St. Mary's, which he founded, they would always have the legends that he had learned English from Patrick Henry and James Monroe. And I could never find that source, and I wasn't going to put it in my book if I couldn't find it. And yet the dates worked out, and I figured that he must have gone to the speeches. The year he arrived, not able to speak. In fact, I found an ad he put in the paper that he would teach French. And it was when Patrick Henry was giving a series, it was 1791, of talks, and he must have sat there just imbibing upon the rhetoric. But I never could find any evidence that the other fact that there was sort of that James Monroe and he were close friends. I went down to Richmond, where the archives, nothing what I just said about that Lincoln letter. And of course, every sheet of paper was behind plastic and stuff like that. And I got past the indiced things, and I kept looking. By this time, I knew Dubois' handwriting better than my own. And I turned the plastic page, and all of a sudden, I was looking at Dubois' handwriting. And I practically went, Eureka! And it was a very interesting letter. He was pleading, Monroe was then governor, pleading with him not to execute a slave who had killed his master. It's a great letter. And I've researched, I have no idea whether it was successful or not. But then Dubois developed a very loving relationship with Monroe's daughter, Eliza. And of course, once the revolution was over and things settled down, Simon Broutet was in Paris all through the worst of the revolution. He was a child. And during the Reign of Terror, he used to be disguised as a baker boy to go into the prisons where the aristocracy were with a priest disguised as a baker. And the boy would carry the Eucharist in. He became a physician, and then a late vocation to the priesthood, and ended up in Emmitsburg. And that's why I said the three of them was a dynamic of grace. It was a marvelous thing. But I had so much fun, looking at the research. The Pentecost Eve thing, I may rewrite it. Anybody read John Meacham's book on Thomas Jefferson? But when you get done with the text, it's like a third of the book are his endnotes. And I may go through the book and take out, it was Bill O'Connor of O'Connor's Religious Goods, God rest him, great guy. And he picked up Pentecost Eve from the shelf. He says, you always give people too much. And he picked up some book, frothy thing, Jesus makes me happy, or something like that. And I thought, that's what I got to get into. And, but I think the text is hard to follow. What I was determined to do, and I say it in the first paragraph of the preface of the book, I went into the seminary. I was working at night at the Times-Union, which doesn't mean I knew anything, but that was a gopher, okay? And Jimmy worked around the corner. You did too for a while. And that was when Clinton Square was really Clinton Square and everything like that. It was Sheridan Avenue. That's where the plant was. It's next door now, obviously. But I went into the seminary after my junior year in college. And when I went there in the fall of '62, that was when the council opened up. And when I got home around Christmas time, in those days you got like 3 days off, I met a Siena classmate, and he asked me something about the Vatican Council. And as I said in the preface, I had no idea what he was talking about. And I said then, if that says something about how stupid I was, what about the seminary? It was obvious. So I went on a quest. I took the last year when I was working at the newspaper, and I decided only to go to popular sources, no academic sources. And I'm sorry I didn't stick with my working title, which was A View from a Pew in 1962, because I stuck with, like Sign Magazine, Catholic Digest. What I wanted was what the ordinary Joe and Jill thought. And I published it myself because it wasn't politically correct. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. It's just that memories don't serve well. If somebody wants to give you the remembrances of a time in history, be very suspicious of them. Harry Truman's book, Plain Speaking, there's an annotated, revised copy. The guy says, plain speaking, he lies all the way through it. He's convinced himself he's telling the truth. That nothing jives out in it, but plain speaking. You write one of the best books you can ever read that was written at the end of her life, Delatour Road, is named after Madame Delatour. That little brick house there was her farmhouse. She escaped in the middle of the French Revolution. And when Talleyrand came to this area, she, having escaped as she did, and found religion. Her baby died up in that farmhouse. And in her memoirs, it's so beautiful. She said, "It was then I found religion. And I knelt on my baby's grave and prayed God to restore my soul to me." When Talleyrand came to visit the Schuyler's, and they knew each other from Paris, she would not speak to him, because he had, walked away to save his neck from what every other priest had suffered over there. But with the Pentecost Eve thing, I had so much fun getting, what was happening that year. For instance, when publishers would get it, they'd say, "You're wrong about the liturgical movement. That was on its way to something." And I would say, "No, it's not. You're reading back." In the preface of the book, I quote bishops as they got on the planes to go to Rome. And paper after paper would ask them, "What's going to happen over there?" "Darned if I know." I mean, there was nothing. When I was on sabbatical in Rome in the late 80s, I read in a book somewhere that they claimed that an outline of the council was sent to every single bishop throughout the world that was coming. How many of you know Monsignor Bob Hart? He's long gone, Chiefy Hart. And he was the peritus, the expert, if you will, who went with Bishop McGinn, who I love like a grandfather, okay? And I had a funeral in St. Teresa of Avila Church. It was Ed Popkowski's father. But we were in the sacristy, and there's a square table in the middle of the sacristy. And it was an interesting moment. I said to him, "When you left for the Vatican Council, did you get any outline of what it was going to be?" And I touched such a nerve that he hit the table. "Nothing." We left for Rome with nothing on our hands. We had no idea. "Oh, this is good." Only 2 people in Pentecost Eve get quoted with the memory. He's one because he has such a razor-sharp brain. And the other was Sister Monica Murphy, who's just such a straightforward person. And she remembered, talk about why we needed the changes, her first day in a Josephite convent, which then was on Madison Avenue in Albany. And she arrived for her novitiate, and her older sister was already in the convent. And they both still are. And her sister greeted her at the door, but never said anything. She was assigned to bring Monica to her room. And she was so hurt, her sister wouldn't say anything to her. Nobody bothered to explain to them, and that was the rule. And that's her memory of right before the council. Something was outwardly cruel, and it was only because nobody bothered to explain anything back in those days. The other issue that I would say, no, you're wrong about the liturgical movement. They put their money on a dark horse, and the dark horse won. But going over, the bishops would say about the liturgy, well, they might put Joseph's name in the canon. And they did do it. John the 23rd did it right away. But the other chapter was on women. And we've read ourselves backward with memories that don't serve, like women always wanted to be priests and so forth. In 1961, with a 12-month period, 61 to 62 October, and in that year, one and only one woman, her name was Dr. Gertrude Heinzelmann, and from Switzerland, she wrote the Vatican a 9,000-word letter on why women should be priests. And it was publicized in the United States. Not one woman's voice supported her. And Commonweal magazine, which was as liberal then as it is now, made fun of her. And they said, well, We're caught between home and Rome. If we don't support her, our wives will be angry, and if we do, the Vatican will be angry. And then they said, well, we better wait for Vatican III for this one. And it was Notre Dame Press, Ave Maria Press out of Notre Dame. And a classmate of mine from high school was an editor there and said, we'll take it if you change that chapter. And I said, well, you get off your politically correct keg of butter, because if you can't face reality, that's what happened back then. And I had fun writing that, and of course it tanked totally. I'm going to rewrite it and take I wanted everybody to read the actual quotes of the time. So it's overladen with quotes. And what I'm going to do, because John Meacham does it in his Jefferson book, and that's what's giving me the idea, he took all the heavy-duty quotes and moved them to the end. So if you want to go back, I love reading footnotes sometime, and that's what I'll do. I'll take them away from the text. The elegy of innocence turned into the Christmas Herald twins was what they call romans à clef. In French, that means novel with a key. And of course, the key is who are the real people. And it was basically about the death of Bill Hayden in St. Patrick's Watervliet. And he was only 36 when he died. And I wrapped the whole book around that. But of course, they're easy to write because you just write a novel. Some people will disparage novels as far as a way to write history. I disagree. Anybody read Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth? I didn't like the sequel too much, but Pillars of the Earth is one of the best historical books I've read. And the whole plot, when you tell somebody, is how flying buttresses got developed. I mean, it's not, excuse me, I'm going to read that, and it's that thick. It's a can't-put-down read. So well researched. His present series, 2 of them are out, and the third part of the trilogy is being written now, about the 20th century. The first one is called Fall of the Giants. That's World War I. Winter of the World, about World War II. And he just gives you the feel of what it must have been like to have been in Berlin. At my parish tonight in Athens, we've been having a movie series for fall on women who are not in the Bible, but who are historically important. Hildegard of Bingen, Joan of Arc. With that, we showed 2 films of Joan of Arc. The 1927 silent thing, it was incredible photography, was lost for decades. And they found it in a closet in an insane asylum. Isn't that amazing how things get found like that? Brilliant film, The Passion of Joan of Arc. And then the Lily Sobieski miniseries in 1999. As one review said of it, and it's quoted on the internet, they finally got it right, historically, theologically, emotionally. And it's just done very, very well. The one bad review it got was somebody criticizing her performance, and he said of her, she plays it like a teenage kid at the mall. And you would say, correct, because that's what she was. She's 19 years old when she was burned at the stake. The movie we're showing tonight is Edith Stein, and I've warned people in advance, it's not going to be a fun evening. It's a lot like Schindler's List. She was a Jewish existentialist philosopher. The first people that Hitler went after was college professors. There's a marvelous book, I can't think of the title, written by a Polish countess who was a teacher. And it's just so horrible to read it. I have it at the jail. It's on a bookshelf in Coxsackie. And I lent it to Rabbi Gulick, Susan Gulick, to look at it. And I said, just so you see how Catholics were suffering at the same time. She ended up in a concentration. She survived it. But she wrote one heck of a book that was only published in like 2001. The Edith Stein conversion to Catholicism came after she was reading Teresa of Avila. And at one point she just stopped and said to herself, and it's in the film, this is truth. And what was beautiful about her was, when she was canonized a saint, some Jewish people kind of resented that. And yet, when you look at her life, she never left her Jewishness. She always said, I am a Jew who is a Catholic. And then she was a Carmelite nun, and the Nazis took her out of the Carmelite convent. And they were so afraid of her that she wasn't even 5 minutes off the train at Auschwitz before she was in a gas chamber. It's such a powerful, history can be a great vehicle. One book that you do have in the library here is a very good study of Margaret Mitchell by a Tallahassee professor. It's called Southern Daughter, and it's in this library. He spent 10 years writing it, which is what it took Margaret Mitchell to write her book. And what he developed was, okay, she's writing that so close to the Civil War that the woman who she was modeling the story on, her grandmother, whose real name was Annie Fitzgerald, and she lived through all the, the burning of Atlanta and everything like that, mean lady. She was still alive as the book was being written, and her granddaughter did not get along with her at all. When the book and then the subsequent movie were made, every now and then when the movie's on a re-release, somebody will say, it's dated in its racism. Of course it is, as is the book. She's a Southerner remembering the Civil War the way her family taught it to her. And in the movie, by the way, David O. Selznick was actually a very enlightened person. There's photographs of when the film was being made, African-American and white actors all ate at the same table. And in the film, she'd never see the Ku Klux Klan. He would not put that on screen because when it was done in the Birth of a Nation, it reignited the Klan. The Klan was never so strong as it was in the 1920s. And the film, The Birth of a Nation, largely heroized them and did that. And Selznick was damned if he was going to put that on the screen because he was Jewish. They went after Catholics, they went after blacks, and he was not going to do that. But when people say, they should have, if it was made today, it would be made like, remember the movie The Patriot a few years ago? Come on, we read our 21st century sensibilities back into a story, in that case, the American Revolution. And if I was teaching a group of African Americans, I'd say, wouldn't it be terrible if they changed Gone with the Wind? Because what you have is two different levels of history being represented. The Civil War itself, written by a woman who was raised hearing those stories as a child. And then the movie showing us where we were in this country in 1939. And we had so much to go back then, but if you ever took that away and said, if you remember in The Patriot, they had in Virginia, a slave-owning master fighting shoulder to shoulder with one of the slaves. Oh, come on, that never would have happened back then. The chaplains to the imprisoned, the dissertation, I had an interesting time doing that because nobody had broken that ground. And the book was basically two parts, a history of chaplaincy. I found like an engraving. I wanted to make it the cover of the book, but nobody would hear of it. And the first real jail in the United States was Walnut Street in Philadelphia. And somebody did an etching drawing of the first time they ever had religious services. And I wanted this for the cover. So all the inmates are sitting there in this yard, and presumably a minister is there, and they have a cannon facing the inmates. And like somebody's ready to touch them before they even spoke, and I thought, oh, what a great cover for a book. Because chaplains are so obscure, a lot of times in a book, they're not even indiced. So what I did, this is SUNY Albany, the graduate school libraries, Hawley Library down, the old State Teachers College, and all the criminal justice books are there. And I waited until school was out so that I could just go book by book by book and thumb through them for references to, and you'd find them. Every now and then there'd be a sentence on that. Had an interesting interchange with W. Michael Phillips, who wrote the book about Gary Evans, Every Move You Make. Gary Evans had me fooled. He was in and out of jail all the time, and I thought that his MO was stealing antiques, and then he had fenced them. And he had me totally fooled. I thought he was a sweet, nice guy. He escaped once from Rensselaer County Jail, and it made the newspapers all in one day. I happened to be in the facility at the time he did it, and he didn't think it through. The yard there used to be where they parked all their cars, and they'd move all the cars out and let everybody have wreck. And he went over the wall, got away. They distracted with the fight at the other end. And stupidly, he forgot to put his shirt on. So he's running through downtown Troy, with no shirt on, and he climbed a tree in front of the county courthouse. And when the crowds finally noticed him, it became the celebrity thing of the day. Yo, buddy! And they finally picked him off. He got over on, if you look at the building, it's got a little, what do you call it? Jutting thing, you know, that he could stand on. And finally they got a cherry picker or just, you arrested him that way. You get into the cherry picker. And he was a serial murderer. And he had me fooled. So when I read the book, I wrote a letter to Phelps. And he wrote back. And he said, it never occurred to me to ask a chaplain. You know, because that's how invisible we are. And so then when the present book, Naked as a Jailbird, its first incarnation was when, wanting not to take a course when I was getting my doctorate. I used it for a master's thesis, and it saved me taking a 4-credit course in class. And all I did was go through my journal, as Joe was saying before. And since that was in the mid-'80s, but I stopped for a different reason. I stopped purposely around 10 years after I got there, because what I was losing, and I could see it in the text, was my sense of shock. One of the things that Hans Toke's studies did about corrections officers and cops is they go through a period of burnout. And all the surveys show us, and what he wanted me to do was replicate that. We made up a survey, sent it all through the country for any facility with more than 500 inmates in it. And he found that COs and cops go through a burnout period, then very often come out on the other side and are kind of people of wisdom for it. And sure enough, the same thing happens with chaplains. You go through a severe burnout stage, and then sometimes you come out of it. Some guys don't, and they should quit. I know a couple guys who stayed in it, and they were so totally burned out that they were useless as far as what they were doing. But a lot of people then become like the mellow old person on the mountain, and that followed through. But I realized as looking through non-indiced references to chaplains, that what I've just written has never been written before. It's unique. There's books that people have written about jail ministry, but frankly, they're very self-serving. They're always by Bible thumpers who want to tell you how many people are saved, you know, or that sort of thing. And it's almost every one of them is their memories of it. Where sourcing yourself, and as Joe said before when he was interviewing me on the other TV thing, that what's it like to go back and read your 30-year-old self, and you say, what an idiot I was, not forgetting that you haven't changed. And I went through that, and having used it for my master's thesis, and it was on a shelf in the Holy Library, and every now and then somebody would contact me and say, you know, that'd make a great book, you ought to publish it, blah, blah, blah. So what I did, I began working on it a year or so ago, and just shuffled it like a deck of cards. If you pick up the book, you see that I put the end notes as end notes, because I would always put down the date of something. I was a little timorous of writing it because, after all, I live in this town. And if there's anything I go after, it's the Albany machine. And I went through an editing process. I've only done that once before. It was when the secular company bought Elegy of Innocence. And somebody said this, in fact, it was Phelps. He was on Fred Dicker, and they were talking about the loss of language. We're losing words. You know, they don't teach cursive anymore in schools. And, you know, people write you this blocked lettering sort of thing, and they're intelligent people. But we're losing our love of words itself. Texting has made all sorts of shortened ways of reading. The art of writing a letter is lost. And Phelps was talking about that and how we're losing that. And point I was going to make, and it shot out of my head. But I put the book in, of course, it's you're sourcing yourself. And going through the editing process, it was the editor of Religion over at the Times Union, Rob Brill, good guy and had great ideas. When I was doing the novel, he said, Phelps talking about it, said, do you ever notice how short James Patterson's chapters are? Like one page is, usually there's like 103 chapters. And he just gives you one, and he says, do you realize that's because that's the only attention span his audience has? And I went, wow, that's probably right. One of the things that in Elegy and Christmas are textually the same book. But if I was teaching a writing course, I would make the class look at them both because they just had these, make the chapter shorter, do this, write a stinger at the end of every chapter. And it was tension. It was like 2-3 weeks, whatever it was, of the most intensive creative process I've ever had to be part, because it's like writing into that, you know, I'd go into the editor, okay, what they want. No, that's not good enough. And you go back and write a, and they always wanted a zinger to make the person turn to the next page. And same way, Brill insisted that I chop this down into shorter chapters. And secondly, being afraid to face the public, I had carefully removed it from anything topical. And Phelps does an interesting thing in his Every Move You Make about Gary Evans. And that is that he has italicized names if they're fictional. And the first time he refers to them, because I sat down with a CEO at Rensselaer County Jail, we said, let's figure out who's who here. And it was kind of a fun afternoon because they're all people who've been in and out a lot in the system. And I had done that. And Brill said, no, don't go that route. And he said, and by the way, put the names back into the politicians and stuff like that of what you've got in the footnotes there. And a lot of the stuff that's in that book was in the newspaper. At one point, halfway through the story, I am at war with the officers in Albany County Jail. And if somebody were to stop reading the book there or just quote the book at that point, it looks like I'm very anti-CO. If you read the book to the end, you see a sense of resolution and of realizing, you know, we are a community here. And it's, but when you're doing a journal thing, sometimes you want to change something or say, yeah, but 30 years after this I found. Because in the text itself, and I left his real name because if they were in the newspapers and it was a big issue, and he's dead anyway, he's the one, if you don't know who I'm talking about, that when they were moving him from federal court back to Rensselaer County Jail, I can't believe how he escaped. He was shackled in the back of a federal van. In fact, I was in Albany County Jail watching the new news when that came on. I go, oh my God. Yeah, and I always said Mass at Rensselaer County Friday afternoons, and I always go over the Menands Bridge, so I left it, of course, traffic is inching through it and so on. He broke out the back window, and while shackled, managed to get over to the siding, jumped over it. He did not mean to land on the embankment, I shouldn't laugh, but if he had landed in the water, if you opened the book to the picture sections in the autopsy, he had a key up his nose. What he would always do when he was arrested, somehow he had his own keys to everything. He'd swallow the key, wait 3 days and get it, and he would carry it around with him. And he was always ready for whatever he could do. Fascinating, but I would have been ruining my story because that happened in the 1990s, and I would have been jumping ahead. Likewise, too, the first pages of the book, which are in Boston, Charles Street Jail. Does anybody know that Charles Street Jail is now a luxury hotel? I don't know if I ever want to go in it, but Google it and read that they've turned these different wings. The cells are still there, and they've made them like party bars and everything. And I was so horrified. That was my first exposure to jail. And I thought, oh my God, how can you do this to human beings? Now it's a luxury hotel. And but when we were being shown around, and about 3 weeks after we started, there was a huge riot in the jail. And we were told not to come in. I was in a Franciscan novitiate at the time. I flunked out, obviously. And but that was our house job. Some of us were assigned to do that. And of course, I've been teaching at Catholic High for a million years, so I didn't need to teach, and I didn't want to do nursing homes because but I'd never been in a jail before. So totally inexperienced. But at one point after the riot, one of the novices who was doing it, there were 4 of us doing it, one of whom is now the Archbishop of Puerto Rico. When the riot happened, and it was in the Boston newspaper, one guy said, they said that $500,000 damage had been done. He says, oh my God, they've slashed the Raphaels. And we were joking about it, but this Monsignor Burke, who was the chaplain there, and of course I was a bonanza for him because I could say Mass. He said, you take care of the women. And it was a nice relationship. He took that line about the Raphaels, and he says, do you know that there is a Salvador Dali, I don't know what you call it because it was done in charcoal, hanging in the mess hall of Rikers Island. Rikers Island, and I went all through it when I was doing my chaplains of the in prison thing. Irene Richards, she was the African-American woman, in charge of all this, like chaplains and stuff like that. Rikers Island is literally a city of the incarcerated. Got like 20,000 inmates. And yet, a medium-sized jail like Albany County, and I'm not knocking the way they run Albany County so much as the fact that given the nature of what jails are, they are the worst place in the criminal justice system because everybody's there. The mass murderer like Gary Evans and a kid who was just stealing hubcaps, and they're all eating lunch together. And that's the nature of the thing. When they go to prison, they'll be sent maximum security, medium, that sort of thing. Prisons and jails are very different realities, and jails are a very tough place. What you want to do when you're sourcing yourself is jump ahead to something you know. You want to read something interesting? Google Salvador Dali, Rikers Island. And when you see it in my book, I wanted to jump ahead and say, but folks, do you know what happened to that painting? It was like in the 1990s, maybe even a little after that. It was stolen. They moved it from the mess hall. You will read this on the Google thing if you do it. They moved it from the mess hall to like an entranceway to the jail, which was wrong anyway, because he meant that. He was going to come to Rikers Island to give a talk to an art class. He was sick and couldn't go, like a strep throat. And so he stood there and 20 minutes did that for them. It's been valued at $500,000 when it existed. Because behind glass there, all of a sudden it went missing. You know, sometimes when you see a brutality thing or something like that, how many times in the last year have you seen something on film? Like there was one incident out of Albany County Jail was on film, I think last spring. Anybody remember that? A setup to get a guy beat up by an officer on screen. And I'm not telling you tales out of school, that was on the news, okay? Why do people do things when they know they're being filmed? I mean, it was stolen, and guess how they found who did it? It was on film. It was officers. And here's the horrible part. And I'm so tempted to put it in the text, and I thought, no, I'm jumping the story if I do that. It's no longer than what I was experiencing, what I know now. When they realized that they were on the trail, they destroyed the Dali painting. That was the end of it. It's like one of the things, this coming Sunday is the final Sunday of the church year, Christ the King. And my Methodist homily guide there, it's very great, refers to a map, Mappa Mundi Christiani. It's sometimes called the Ellsdorf map. Google that and see what comes up. It was found in the 1840s, 1843 to be exact. And it was 30 sheepskins, 12 by 12, and there's been other, the most beautiful mosaic I've ever seen is in St. Clement's Church in Rome. Anybody ever been there? 12th century. Oh, I think it's the greatest work of art. Google it. St. Clement's apse mural, I guess you'd put. And it'll come up, beautiful color. But the other one, the Mappa Mundi Christiani, exactly 70 years after they found it in 1843, was destroyed during World War II in a bombing raid. You know, what we do to ourselves as a people. Anyway, we got like 15 minutes. Anybody got any questions?
Some questions about being a chaplain?
What, Joe?
Yeah, you want to take some questions about
Oh, yeah.
being a chaplain?
Yes.
In your experience, it looks like the epicenter for a lot of the trouble with the young criminals is the black young man. And over the years, have you seen any change in that situation?
It's such a complicated question and reality because all of the above are true. Like when you say Alice, what's her last name? Greenberg? Alice Green. She's on target with a lot of what she says because the availability of legal connections. I think the saddest kids in the system are oftentimes upper middle, and it's in the book, because their parents always call the politicians and get them out of trouble, and they think they can play the game at a higher level of stakes. And then sometimes you see a kid, in the book it's the instance of a kid from Del Mar, and he was out on bail while he stole a bike, and he had all sorts of very strict things that he had to do, and of course he broke them. And the judge sent him to prison for 2.5 years because the kid thought because his parents were powerful, nobody was ever going to touch them. Back in the 1890s, when, Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde went to prison for 2 years, I think it was, Reading Prison. And what he said, and it's almost a direct answer to your question, he was one of the great playwrights of the era, and he lost his family, and he wrote, it's called, it's kind of half whining, half good, De Profundis, which is Psalm 130. Out of the depths I have cried to you, O Lord. And it's like the length of a short story. And he said, the poor have it much better in jail because they're not shocked by it. And when a poor person comes to jail, their friends come visit them. There's no shame involved. They know it right away. And when a person such as himself goes to jail, they lose their life. I think it's shameful that when the day he got out of prison, he had decided he wanted to become a Catholic. And he had tried to arrange with a monastery to go on retreat there. And they refused to take him. And he lived 3 more years. He died in Paris. He was such a person for quotes. He collapsed on a street. And a friend of his he never knew whether to take him seriously about conversion to Catholicism, so he was kind of ignoring him. He was a Catholic. And they carried him from the street into a 5-star hotel, and the quip he made was, "I'm dying beyond my means." And they sent for an Irish Dominican. In fact, that would be at St. Clement's, because that's where they were. Google St. Clement's. It's the most incredible architectural thing in the city of Rome. The dig that they did under it's amazing. One level, another level, another. Oh, it's marvelous. And it's a don't miss when you go to the city. But it was an Irish Dominican priest here in the middle of Paris. And happily for the sake of history and for us not having too much pie on our face, he stayed with Wilde the entire time, went through the night into the next day, and Wilde finally died very much at peace. Any other questions? Yeah.
What is one thing you would change about the judicial system?
That's a really good question. One thing that I would change about the judicial system.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what would you change about the judicial system? I don't know, Lois. That's a good question, because it's not like there's one overriding thing. It's a zillion things. I've learned to say to kids who say, "You got a lawyer?" "No, I'm a public defender." You say, "Well, they are lawyers." And they say, "Yeah, but they're not good lawyers." And I say, "Oh, no, you can't judge it by that. You can pay big bucks for a lawyer, and they don't do squat for you. And you might have some young man or woman just out of law school who wants to make a career and defend your case. But do remember this when you're, one of my rules is I never give advice as to whether to take a plea, because I don't want somebody sitting in prison and saying, I should never ever listen to him, that sort of thing, because it comes down to like this. But I always say to guys on a tier, you got to remember this about lawyers, no offense to anybody who are. When your case is all over, the judge, the prosecution, and the defense will all go to a country club and have a drink together, because they're all schoolmates. They don't care about you. That's just their business. And when you say, what would you change? You're starting off by dealing with the raw wounds of society. One thing I have said through the years, and probably, there's never a book that's been written like that book, because all I do, it's like, that motorcycle thing where they were wearing the cameras and they did them in where the guy turned out several of them were cops. I'm taking you through jail with a camera in my helmet, and you're just seeing what I see. It's not about me, it's about what I see. And I've always said that you could open the doors of any facility. Now, I've been since the late 1990s down in Coxsackie, which is a max, and Green, which is a medium. And the medium is worse than the max by, it's because they're kids. 2 years in a row, Green was the most violent prison in New York State. And that sounds much more impressive than it was because they record every incident. Great quote from an inmate. I inherited him as a clerk. And he was Hispanic, but so light-skinned that everybody called him Blanco. And until he opened his mouth and you got the Puerto Rican accent, and I really grew to like the kid. His name was Orlando. And he had been in both places. You could graduate up to Coxsackie, you know, if you did something like punch somebody, or graduate down, like supposedly better than to be in Green. And I said, okay, Orlando, because it was when Bishop Hubbard told me, he asked if I would leave the 3 county jails and take the prison system, because he said, I can rearrange the 3 jails, but I'm committed to the state, and it's no longer true. We don't have the priests to do it, which is why I'm technically retired now. But just like I've known so many priests who they've never worked so hard in their life. Father Jim O'Neill, who I was with for 10 years in Spiegeltown, and they're happy. And I still do Rensselaer County each week, and then Green, and we got a special. We're waiting to see what's going to happen at Coxsackie, as you well know. And I've always said you could open the door of any state facility and let 85% of the people out, and it wouldn't affect society any one way or the other. So I think I would want to clarify it. I've always said about Rikers Island, they have huge problems, but they got huge solutions to them. And what they do is, there's a prison for every category. There's a whole, chains separating them all, and the maximum security is just somebody gets arrested for a major crime, they're there. They have an entirely separate facility for pregnant women, which is amazing. Just the sheer volume. And almost as a comic opera thing, when I was going through the place, it was so crowded for the buildings they had. Are you ready? They were housing guys on Staten Island ferries. And they were all lined up on the edge of Rikers Island. And of course, they were putting anybody, there was real low security and sort of thing. But I had this fantasy where they'd break the ropes and get off out into the East River, and you'd do pirate attacks on some of the tour boats. Any other questions? Tom?
How about solitary confinement? Any reaction to that over the years?
Very much so. There was one guy in our SHU unit, special housing unit, who's been in solitary since the early 80s. And he keeps getting more tickets all the time. They keep him in one max for a while, and then they move to another max. And I kind of, related to him in some ways. He did, I wouldn't tell you what he did because it was so terrible that you'd lose sympathy for him. But nobody should be treated that way. It shouldn't have anything to do with the way they are. It should be what we have. George Bernard Shaw said one time, you can always judge a society by what their prisons are like. And they would move him after a couple of years, and I finally went to bat for him in this sense. He kept getting so many tickets, he's going to die down there. He's like in a cave. And I began writing the central offices about it. And I love the quote I got from them. I said, this is not about the guy. And I got a letter back from, I presume he's like 20 years old or something like that. And he said, you don't know him like we do. And I wrote back and said, excuse me, have you ever seen this guy? I talk to him every few days. You're telling me you know him because you have his stupid paperwork, and I don't know him because I deal with him face to face? And to me, that's everything about the system. Bureaucracy. Bureaucracy in the church, bureaucracy in the state, bureaucracy everywhere. It's the dirtiest word in the world. Any other questions? We got, yes.
Is there anything the average citizen or, humanitarian can do for his own prison?
Well, here's our Residents Encounter Christ people. If you turn around, there's the Tom and Peg O'Connor. They're volunteers, and Tom Morrison. We have men and women who come into the facility and run 3-day retreats, and also come in for Bible study, and it does marvelous things. Things are way better. Attica was a turning point because Attica made the media start going after facilities. And they're much more an open reality now than they ever were before. And that's to the good. There's very little that's hidden anymore. And I like that. So that, some things do improve that way. But it's obviously, we've got a lot more to go. There's no solution because these things are just crazy. Yeah.
What percentage of the people in there are drugs a big factor in that?
Oh, yes.
How do you
yes,
feel
yes.
about decriminalizing drugs?
I've always said that, I've been saying it for years. Somebody said, it wasn't my quote, the war against drugs is over and all we have now is the body count. There's some things it was like prohibition. I mean, I'm, wary of drugs and what they do to people, and I know a lot of young addicts who you'd love. Father Peter Young, what great work he does. And I gave him a box of books because he had his craft fair the other day. And I said, just sell them and put them toward the program. I said, but don't tell Catholic Charities. It's like Army, Navy fighting each other. Very high, and the statistics come from others, like 85% are addicted on one thing or another. And that's our whole country, though. I would have legalized drugs just, the worst this country ever had as far as prohibition was when we outlawed it. And all of a sudden that introduced real mob activity in this country.
So what's the difference between being addicted to alcohol or addicted to any other kind of
You
drug?
got it. Addiction is addiction is addiction. And
It could be controlled the same way through laws. You can't drive under the influence of anything.
there's a movie called Blow. And who's in it? Who is he? Johnny Depp? I think it's Johnny Depp. And it's a true story about the 1980s. And the opening line of the book he narrates, or movie, as he said, if you bought cocaine during the 80s or 90s, very likely, indirectly, I sold it to you. And we show it to guys, I don't, but the people who are running the AA and NA and stuff like that in the prisons show it to guys, and it has a profound effect on them. I think the best movie I've ever seen about addiction is Michael King in, what's the name of the movie? Whatever it is. If you Google Michael Keaton and movies, and he is arrested. His girlfriend ODs next to him on a bed. In fact, has a great opening where you think it's going to be a sex scene, and all of a sudden he recoils from the body, and she's out, and he gets arrested for it, and he tries to evade the law by going into a rehab. And it's a stark story of a man. He sneaks out of the rehab one night and goes back to his business office, and somewhere in his office he has stashed cocaine. It's one of the most grueling scenes you'd ever want to see. He starts looking, and there's a cleaning woman out in the hall with a mop, and she's watching him. He starts kicking desks over. He goes crazy trying to find the cocaine. And it's a great movie on addiction. And the last scene in the movie, it's the only laugh in the movie, he's talking to like an AA group, and as he's doing it, it's a fog of smoke while he's doing it, and he says, and I admit that I am an addict, and I'd like to thank you for not smoking. And that being his last line, we've been here an hour, I said it's mine too. Thank you for coming.